The views, assumptions, and opinions expressed by the Godfather hosts, guests, and callers on the program are strictly their own and do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of Electrocast Media.
Xi Jinping, he's not a very bright man, you know. I mean, he's very like Stalin. He's never the cleverest man in the room, but he's the most cunning. He's the one that everyone fears. He's the one that can make things happen, even though he doesn't follow arguments all that well. And so he's not a very flexible man. So on the one hand, you've got the leadership, and that sense, just like with North Korea. I mean, North Korea is a real nuisance to Beijing, but they've got to support it. And there's a feeling now that Moscow is becoming a bit like Pyongyang. It's a real nuisance, a much bigger version of North Korea, but they've got to support it.
Welcome to the Godfather Wars, the real talk on understanding how geopolitics impacts you and your world.
We're your hosts, Barak Sina.
And I'm Leah Tedrow.
Thank you for joining us as we take a deep dive behind the topics affecting the world we live in today.
Welcome back to the show, where we're continuing our discussion on Ukraine, the world after the war, part 2. In this episode, we'll be diving deeper into the analysis of the situation in the Ukraine, what's happening on the ground now, and possible future outcomes. We have a very special guest this episode, Professor Michael Clarke, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Special Advisor to the British Joint Committee on National Security, Strategy, and Specialist Advisor to the House of Commons Defense Committee. He'll be joining us later on in the program, where we'll be discussing the realities on the ground and how the chess pieces are being moved around locally and internationally, their impact and potential outcomes, and what that means for Europe and the wider world. Our usual segments of what this means to you and who's who in The Godfather, where we, and by we I mean Barak, will discuss which countries are emulating the traits of characters from The Godfather. So with that, let's get started. Barak, it's been a very eventful situation going on in the Ukraine and around the Ukraine since our last episode. We've had a U.S. presidential visit from Biden. We've had a pullout of the START treaty from Putin and an address to the Assembly. So why don't you take us through that? But before you do, I just want to let you know that I'm playing complete devil's advocate against everything you say today.
I didn't realize that it would be devil's advocate. I just assumed that you'd be your natural disagreeable self.
Oh my goodness, like this is normally your role. You're like the doomsday sayer in everything that we do. I'm the positive one who's going through things. You're so like, this is normally your role of just arguing against me for the sake of it.
I do so agreeably.
Okay, before we get into any more of this, why don't you get us started?
I think that what's going on in the international community is really marked by strategic ambiguity. You see that countries are really ambivalent and reluctant to commit to a specific side. They're hedging bets, and this is happening globally. So, for example, if you look at China's economy is struggling to rebuild post-COVID. And in the short term, China doesn't want to cut itself off from Western markets. China's economic interests will influence the extent that China allies itself with Russia. And China's got a really transactional worldview that's incredibly pragmatic, and it's aspiring to be a military and economic superpower. That's its priority. And everything it does is through that prism, and that requires that it deepens its ties with Western markets, and it won't want to jeopardize them for Russia, that in contrast is creating a fortress economy. So President Xi Jinping was led to believe initially that the Ukraine invasion would be swift and it would be rapidly over. And to a degree, he distanced himself from Putin in the wake of this protracted conflict that attracted a harsh Western backlash that he didn't anticipate would occur. And in turn, China views the West's robust response to Ukraine as a simulation for how it may respond to China invading Taiwan. And even though in the short term, China might be very reticent to take harsh measures against Taiwan, in the Indo-Pacific, the CIA has recently warned that China has plans to take Taiwan by 2027. And NATO Secretary General has spoken about the butterfly effect that takes place when something happens in Ukraine. So in the Asia-Pacific, there's also going to be ripple effects that are felt. So the question is, to what degree is China put off from its ambitions to take over Taiwan? And the question remains...
No, I agree with you because I think you're seeing what's happening right now. Like China has just recently called for a ceasefire and peace talks in a 12-point plan to end the war, which Biden has dismissed. And then at the same time, you have China's top diplomat praising, Russian-Chinese relations, and the U.S. then warning China about providing lethal support to Russia. So there seems to be this big push-pull thing, and China is caught firmly in the middle of it, even though they don't want to be.
So that ambiguity that you've identified is just spot on, because on one hand, China wants to present itself as an impartial mediator between Russia and Ukraine with its 12-point peace plan, and at the same time, it refuses to use the word invasion or condemn Russia.
But that's the same language that Putin was using in his recent assembly, right? He stopped short of calling it a war. He was calling it special operations and special forces mission in the Ukraine. He's refusing to call it a war.
And I think that feeds into its long-term, there's a tension between its short-term objectives, which is to carefully tread the line between the West and East. And it needs to consider whether it would risk its economic advancement for the sake of its political ambitions. And those political ambitions in the long term is to challenge the international order that deems democracies as a threat. And to that end, it's already considering sending drones and other sophisticated weaponry to aid Russia. So it is walking a tightrope. So how do you manage to present yourself as a mediator with a 12-point peace plan and at the same time send advanced weaponries to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, especially since you have such a united force behind, Ukraine, like the EU, NATO, and Ukraine discussed procurement of arms and ammunition in their first trilateral meeting recently. G7 leaders are stepping up Russian sanctions. It's going to come to a point where neutrality is no longer an option, and they're going to have to choose sides. The East-West divide is becoming deeper and more divisive by the day. And I don't think, I think the Middle East will continue to get away with neutrality because they are just completely being neutral. They're just staying very quiet about this. But for those that have aligned with Russia, like Iran and China, and the other nations, it will be increasingly difficult for them to walk a tightrope, and it will come to a point where they will have to choose.
Look, we see the same type of ambiguity with India, because India has historically maintained really close ties with Russia, and at the same time it's increased economic ties with the West. And you've got to bear in mind that India is dependent on Russia for oil, and it purchases 55% of its defense supplies from Russia. It's not going to sort of, in a unilateral manner, come out against Russia. But at the same time, India doesn't want Russia and China to coalesce, because that would make China a greater strategic competitor to India than it already is. So on one hand, you've got this dynamic where India is reaching out to the West in order to shore up its defense and security against China. At the same time, it's buying into the Russian-Chinese alignment because it doesn't want China to become too powerful. India maintains that non-aligned policy that it had during the Cold War.
Anyway, if you're going to mention the Cold War, I think we're seeing another Cold War about to start again, with Putin announcing that Russia has suspended participation in the New START Treaty, which is a bilateral agreement to mutually decease and limit strategic nuclear weapons signed between the U.S. and Russia in 2002. So the fact that he's now suspended that participation is further increasing this East-West divide, and also, is language moving us back into another Cold War potentially.
In one sense, I understand where you're coming from, but ironically, on one hand, the nuclear threat would prevent countries from decisively aligning themselves with Russia, or it could even bring those countries to shift and realign themselves with the West, because ambivalence is a luxury. Strategic ambiguity is something that allows somebody to hedge from both sides, but a genuine, credible nuclear threat prevents that from continuing. And this past year, there's been regular nuclear weapons threats from Russia directly aimed at NATO countries such as Britain. And there's also warnings that have emerged from the West, with Biden declaring that the risk of a nuclear Armageddon is its highest for 60 years. So if this continues to escalate, and if Russia is not just simply pure bluster, but this actually escalates, then perhaps, ironically, it could undermine its own alliance system and cause countries like India to actually shift towards the West, and it could cause China to actually press the brakes and reset Russia or step back from its alliance with Russia.
When you actually look at this, I think that you're starting to see the strain of the war on Russia, because I think it's currently a stalemate war of attrition between the Ukraine and Russia at the moment. In Putin's recent address to the Russian Federal Assembly, he said that he was targeting the regime and not the people of Ukraine, and possibly why he didn't launch a major attack on the 24th, which was the 1-year anniversary of the war. But, on the same day that he announces this, they had a deadly attack in Kherson, killing 6 people and injuring 12 more. That has been the recent reports. And I think there's also then been, recent intelligence that's coming out from the Ukrainian Northern Operational Command stating that the purpose that Russia is about to commit false flag operations, and that would be accusing Ukrainian forces of violating the territorial integrity of unspecified countries, but most likely referring to Belarus. The Kremlin may be preparing for these false flag attacks to coerce Belarus into the war, following, Lukashenko's statement that Belarus would only enter the war if attacked by Ukraine. The Belarusian Ministry of Defense also, stated recently that they've noticed a buildup of Ukrainian forces at its borders, and a Belarusian or Russian attack on northern Ukraine regions is highly unlikely. But I think Russia is seeking to force Lukashenko's hand, or at least blame Ukraine for expanding the war to undermine support for Kyiv. So I think this is a strategic plan to get more help, involve it, expand it, and sort of, make it less about a Russia versus Ukraine thing, and just kind of spread the misery a bit and spread it out, and trying to get, Belarus involved and, and help lighten the load for Russia.
I think that on this point, Leah, I think that there's a strategic error that could easily be made, which is to judge everything via the prism, to judge Putin's actions purely through the prism of Russia's conflict with Ukraine. And it's possible, well, it's actually likely that two things are happening in parallel with one another, and that to a degree, the Ukraine conflict is a sideshow, because on one hand, you could easily focus on how Russia's inadvertently led to the expansion of NATO, with Finland and Sweden wanting to join up, or how Russia's tactically or strategically miscalculated. And the war in Ukraine can blindside the West from Russia's expanding borders that are increasingly neighboring Europe. I mean, recently, Russia's presidential director for cross-border cooperation reveals how it seeks to annex all of the Baltic states, including Belarus, by 2030, as well as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Moldova. And in turn, people from those countries could be recruited for fighting. These Baltic states are bordering NATO and EU member states, which would suck them into a conflict. So this is precisely the stuff that could spill over to World War III, including the creation of an alternative world order by having countries such as China or Iran entering Russia's orbit, or not necessarily their orbit, but there being a convergence between their operational and logistical sharing, as well as their strategic long-term alignment as well, as a counterweight to the US.
But I'm seeing signs that I don't think Russia has the stamina for this. I think, like you said earlier, I think they thought that this was going to be over very, very quickly. I mean, we've seen the latest reports are saying that they've lost 200,000 Russian soldiers already in this Ukrainian war in the last year. You're seeing Russia now trying to create intelligence indicating that they're going to commit false flag operations to try and drag Belarus, into this conflict. And speaking of dragging people in, I think it's important for us to acknowledge at this point, when we're talking about Russia being sort of desperate for supplies and reinforcements and having the stamina to carry this forward, there's some larger ramifications from previous U.S. actions. Like when we fled Afghanistan, we left a huge void. And Putin is now taking advantage of that by hiring U.S.-trained Afghan Special Forces soldiers. He's offering them $1,500 a month and citizenship for them and their families if they fight. And who can blame them? They have no real country to fight for now, so to speak. And they're just trying to survive and provide for their families, and they're leaving in droves. Recent fighting has reported that they've found 30 of these Afghan soldiers that were killed in action. So this is a new reality. U.S.-trained soldiers are now being used on the battlefield against Ukrainians as a direct result of the U.S. abandoning its efforts in Afghanistan, and Putin has seized on this opportunity. But if he had the supplies and the stamina to do this, would he even need to recruit Afghan soldiers that are there? He's taken a massive loss of 200,000 soldiers. How much longer can he continue this?
Look, in any vacuum of governance, you're going to see bad actors fill the void, whether it be from around the world. There's no reason why Ukraine should be any different from, say, Syria or Iraq, where you have foreign fighters just fill the vacuum of governance. It would be more of a surprise if that didn't happen.
But he's actively recruiting them. This is an active recruitment.
He has to do that. He's got no choice. In order for him to survive, in order for him to claim any type of victory to this disastrous war, he needs to be doing these two things in parallel. He needs to be expanding the borders. He needs to be demonstrating himself to his nation that his legacy project is to reconstitute the imperial empire. He has imperial ambitions. If he was to lose this war and accept defeat, there would probably be a coup and he would probably be killed. He needs to do this for the sake of regime survival and his own personal survival.
Well, we've said that. We said that on our last episode, that he's in a position of do or die at this point. It's either abject failure and he's going to fight to the death. He doesn't have a choice at this point. But I think if we're on the topic of stamina, with Russia suffering, catastrophic losses and, having the mobilization, and I think his recent Federal Assembly was, even though it didn't mention it, was kind of all the patriotism and the praise for the military, is probably language leading up to another mobilization because they desperately need it. But on the other side of that, how long is the West's ongoing support really going to last? Because Ukraine receives the most military aid from the United States since the beginning of the war, as of January 15th, 2023, so this year. It's been reported that $46.6 billion in financial aid has been given to the Ukraine for military purposes. The payments to Ukraine have already exceeded the annual military expenditure of the U.S. in the war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2010. And to put this into perspective, U.S. military aid expenditure in the Korean War from 1950 to 53 was $138 billion. The Iraq War from 2003 to 2010 was $125 billion. And the Vietnam War from 1965 to 75 was $90 billion. In the U.S., criticism of the scale of military aid to the Ukraine is already coming from within Republican ranks. And some of the U.S. Republicans in Congress have announced that they intend to block aid to Ukraine. However, the day after his visit to Kyiv, U.S. President Biden underscored the U.S.'s commitment to continue support of the Ukrainian war effort when he spoke in Warsaw, saying this is not just about freedom in Ukraine, it's about freedom of democracy in general, which is the overall theme of where they're getting all of this support. But I think we also need to look further into the costs.
I think, Leah, this has got nothing to do with Ukraine. I think all those people that are focused on, hey, look, let's not continue supporting Ukraine, what's this got to do with us?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I get it. But this is also Russia's, language of what Putin is recently saying. He's saying they're using Russia, or they're using Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. That's what the U.S. is doing.
But it's more than Russia. It's more than Ukraine. It's about the security and stability of Baltic states. It's about whether there's a new orbit being created with an alignment of Russia, China, and Iran. You can't ignore those dynamics. You can't only focus on Ukraine and focus on the aid that Ukraine is being given. It's got to be part of a geopolitical context.
I don't disagree with that, and that is further to my point. But how much more can they withstand? Because if you look at the wider scope of costs, right, this isn't just affecting the U.S. wallet. To date, the UK have provided $5 billion, Poland, $2.5 billion, Canada, $1.35 billion, $900 million from the Netherlands, $690 million from Italy and France, $620 million from Norway, etc. These are the top 10 providers of military aid.
With these burgeoning costs and with the strategic realignments that are taking place and the escalating range of targets beyond Ukraine's borders, this is a world war. This is becoming a world war. So Ukraine is just the front line of that world war. And if it's a world war, nobody's going to sort of scale back from military provisions. They're going to just continue ramping it up.
I get that, but my point is that how much more financial aid can countries provide? I mean, the list that I just went through is just from the top 10 countries alone, which is over $61 billion in just military aid that's been supplied in the last 12 months. I mean, that's just military aid. The U.S. has provided an additional $9.5 billion in humanitarian aid and $15.2 billion in financial aid. And if you look at The surrounding countries, Latvia has contributed 350 million euros in the first 8 months of the war, which is 1% of that country's GDP. And Estonia has contributed just under that of their GDP to the effort, which is seriously significant when you consider that even though it's a lot of money, the financial support from the U.S. only equates to 0.25% of its GDP. This is creating an enormous drain financially to countries globally, and even though all the countries currently supporting the Ukraine have publicly stated that their support remains steadfast for all the reasons that you've stated, and I agree with that, how much longer can they sustain that? I mean, where is the line drawn, and can the line be drawn? I don't think it can, because giving ground to Putin would be waving a white flag to the rest of the world and sending a message that it's okay to just go in and seize territory whenever and wherever you like. It'd be an enormous sign of weakness and vulnerability, and the world, and I think NATO, know this. But you're also seeing within these countries of saying, great, we've provided aid and we get the wider scope and the geopolitical picture, which is what you were talking about. But how much more drain can they sustain? I mean, according to a survey from Ipsos and Reuters taken at the end of last year, it found that U.S. public supports sending aid, but not troops. I mean, 73 said that we should continue to support Ukraine despite Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons. 66% have said we should provide weapons to Ukraine. 59% said we should send financial aid in addition to sending weapons. But 65% have stated their concern that the war may escalate if Ukraine is provided longer-range weapons that could hit undisputed Russian territory. And only 34% said we should send troops to the Ukraine to help defend it from a Russian invasion. And I think the other thing that we're not looking at that's not calculated into these costs is the legacy of, the conflicts that we've been involved in over the last 20 years, like Iraq and Afghanistan, because many of the U.S. defense contractors supporting the military aid efforts were initially using legacy contracts from Afghanistan and Iraq, where a cost calculation for a local national was in the region of $200 to $1,000 a month on average, and life insurance payouts to families around $20,000. Well, $20,000 to an Afghan family may be deemed sufficient. It doesn't make a dent for a Ukrainian family. Or indeed any other European continent country. And on top of that, the cost of hiring quote-unquote local nationals who are Ukrainians is significantly higher. They're well-educated, salary levels are more commensurate to other European nations in the region, and this is making the cost of supporting this war effort much, much higher, and something I don't think anyone thought about in the beginning of the support effort. So it has a knock-on effect across the board. And I just think, while we all agree the reasons why we have to continue supporting that, how much longer can we continue to pour this much money in? And what cost does that have to the global economies at large?
Increased percentages of GDP are going to have to be allocated to defence and security. That's already happening across European states, and it's been unimaginable that that would occur. In turn, there's going to be even greater pressure on the public in that there'll be less money allocated to social resources, greater infrastructure within states, because it will go towards defence and security, going to go back to a 19th, 20th century reality, as opposed to the post-World War II boom era, where things couldn't have been any better.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at it now, the UK is already headed there, right? I mean, look at the cost of living, the inflation amount. You've got strikes all over the place because people aren't getting paid enough. I mean, there were, reports last week that supermarkets are rationing fruits and vegetables. I mean, we're in that already.
We've not even seen the start of it, because as greater percentages of GDP are allocated towards defence and security, who in turn receive a huge budget, they've got to contend with the looming World War III on its doorstep.
But do you not think that that's part of Putin's strategy, is to drain the resources, the will of Europe, and put it on its knees for it to then move strategically, and or China and or Iran? Because if you have these countries that are providing more of their GDP to this effort and then are rationing fruits and vegetables to their people can't afford to heat their homes, they're constantly on strike because they need higher salaries because of those things, that has an enormous global impact, and it really weakens the West significantly. And do you not think this is part of a larger plan?
No, he was surprised by the West's robust response. He didn't anticipate it. Now he may enjoy it in order to attempt to play for time, but he couldn't have anticipated it. And, he'll hope that it plays into his objectives, but he wouldn't have anticipated it from the outset.
No, but he can certainly use it. So I guess it's running against the clock. Can Russia have the stamina to continue this? And does the West and the wider world have enough bandwidth to continue supporting this? But they don't have a choice. But where does the crux come when everybody runs out of money and their states are failing and crumbling as a result, and Russia can no longer afford to keep this war going on? When do we hit that point?
Look, with globalization, there's been an onwards trajectory of increased development, and developed nations were getting more affluent and developing nations were developing. Now you're seeing things turned backwards, and everybody is going to experience this. Developed nations will experience it less acutely than developing nations, but both are going to suffer equally.
So I think playing off of the back of that is looking at how much money is going into front Ukraine and Russia having to expand the war. They're running out of supplies. They're probably going to have to create another mobilization again here soon. So on that theme of running against the clock of, the West, when does their will and or the possibility of them continuing to supply this conflict and, Russia's supplies and people running out, what is China and Iran looking at this and go, everybody's weak, everybody has been splayed out very, very thinly across the board, everybody's stretched to capacity. What are they now doing? How are they moving strategically on the board as a result of what's happening in the Ukraine?
This isn't only affecting China, it's not only affecting Russia and Ukraine. Western diplomatic initiatives have also unraveled. The nuclear talks that America was spearheading with Iran have gone nowhere. And it's even undermined the prospects of nuclear talks when Iran sends Russia shipments of artillery rounds and drones to Russia. And in turn, Moscow provides surveillance technologies to Tehran to suppress their recent domestic protests. And last July, Ali Akbar Veliati, a veteran foreign policy advisor to the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, stated that instead of trying to appease the West, Iran should turn to Russia for support and strategic alignment. Putin, he visited Tehran last July, and Khamenei declared that the motives for Russia's invasion were similar to Iran's in the Middle East. And he went further and he said, had Russia not taken the initiative, the other side would have taken the initiative and caused the war. You see that ripple effect occurring there. Last December, White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, he warned that Russia was providing Iran with an unprecedented level of military and technical support, and that was transforming its relationship into a fully fledged defense partnership. And Russia is offering Iran with increased defense cooperation on missiles, electronics, and air defense, and they're aligning themselves in a deeper and deeper manner. That's going to put Gulf states surrounding Iran or bordering Iran on notice. It affects Israel's security too.
But I think it goes wider than that because, we discussed this last episode as well, is China using this as an opportunity to potentially take Taiwan. Everything is stretched thin. Everybody's over here looking at this diversion of Ukraine. And it's not a diversion. It's a full war. And there is a lot of suffering going on across the board and globally as a result of this. But China may be looking at this and saying, this is an opportunity while everybody is concerned with this war in Europe to then turn around and take Taiwan.
Definitely feasible, but we need to get out of this post-World War II mindset. For example, if we look at the Iraq or the Afghanistan war, it was region-specific. It didn't have multiple fronts, and even when it did have multiple fronts, it was using precision airstrikes, and it was part of a broader doctrine of military transformation. In World War II, there were multiple fronts around the globe, and there is no reason why we cannot return to that reality. History is not linear, it's cyclical, and especially when you've got multiple orbits that can emerge under the guise of multipolarity. So you have Iran that has enormous experience with sanctions placed against it, attempting to show Russia how they can circumvent sanctions, and at the same time they're expanding their trade network in order to overcompensate for sanctions. So they're building extensive new trade networks and supply routes to circumvent sanctions that can send military equipment from Iran to Russia through the river and railway links, as well as through the Caspian Sea. Iran's gone even further in its approach to Russia about receiving assistance for its nuclear program, and Russia has been very reticent to support the nuclear program as it would alienate its regional allies that are Iran's rivals, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These are important trade partners for Russia. But at the same time, you've got Moscow and Tehran seeking to replace SWIFT with domestic financial messaging systems. Iran is looking at what's going on with the international community. And as you've said regarding China making a play for Taiwan because it thinks that the global attention is diverted. Well, that's exactly what Iran has done, as inspectors from the IAEA have found Iran to enrich uranium to an 84% purity. And that's the closest it's been to 90% purity that's required for nuclear weapons. The head of the CIA, William Burns, has warned that if Iran decided, it could at its own will enrich uranium to weapons grade within weeks. So there are ripple effects, and I don't think that any nation has the luxury of saying we're going to reduce our military expenditure, because if they do, then risks in other theatres are going to increase, whether it be in Taiwan or whether it be in Iran, that can affect the Straits of Hormuz, which in turn cause oil prices to shoot up, affecting the global economy.
It's not just a kinetic war. This is also an economic war. Many of these countries now are shifting away from Russian oil and weaning themselves off. So I think you have two kind of battlefronts here, is that one is the kinetic war that is happening in the Ukraine and the financial drain that is happening as a result. And two, you have an economic war, mostly with oil and gas. Well, on that note, I think it is time for us to bring in our very special guest, Professor Michael Clarke, who we introduced earlier in the show, is the former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Specialist Advisor to the British Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, and Specialist Advisor to the House of Commons Defense Committee. So welcome very much to the show, Michael.
Yeah, nice to be here.
So, Michael, I think let's just jump straight in. And I think if you could really sort of go over the current situation, we have just hit the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war. And, you know, your analysis on what's been going on. Putin recently left the START treaty. We've given an enormous amount of aid to the Ukraine. And just if you could just sort of go through where you believe your analysis is on the state of, you know, the nation today as it stands.
Yes, I think it was pretty clear in this war that if the Russians didn't win immediately, that is within 3 or 4 days, then they wouldn't win at all. And that's the situation we're in now. The objectives in this war from the Russian point of view are all over the place. It's not clear what they want out of it. The objectives for the Ukrainians are very clear because they're fighting for their lives. So they're trying to keep their government and their institutions intact against a power that's trying to effectively kill them. You know, it's often said, I mean, Golda Meir said in 1967 in Israel, she said, it's very hard to negotiate with somebody who's trying to kill you. And that's the situation that the Ukrainians are in. They've simply got to fight for their lives. And they interpret that in military terms as being, well, we've got to eject the Russians from our territory, whatever that means, however much territory they mean, but we've got to eject them from our territory, and then we can think about what comes next. So it's a very consistent line that the Ukrainians have got. But the Russians, because they seem to be trying to take over the whole country very, very quickly, that failed, and then it isn't clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to take over a piece of ground, the Donbass, and run a land bridge from the Donbass to the Crimea. That's one thing they want to do. Do they still want to take over the whole country? Probably. Do they still think that Ukraine should be destroyed? Probably. That's what Putin keeps seeming to imply, and people around him seem to imply. But also, from Russia's point of view, this war is not now about Ukraine. It's about this Russian view that the West, since 1991, has obviously had a plan. It's news to the rest of us, but this is what the Kremlin believes. They've had a plan to destroy Russia, not just to compete with Russia, but to destroy Russia. And that this is a process whereby American imperialists are making common cause with German Nazis, who are making common cause with Nazis running Ukraine, to open up a front as the first stage of the destruction of Russia itself. And because the Kremlin doesn't seem to know what it wants from this war, and Putin is stuck with this war that is going wrong, he tries to elevate it into something else. This is a new great patriotic war. Russia's got to mobilize in ways that will be painful, and the only way they can justify that is to say, well, we're fighting for our lives. We, the Russians, are fighting for our lives. It's ridiculous. Turns history on its head, but that's what the Kremlin's saying.
Do you think it's also part of a broader justification for its imperialistic designs?
Yes. I mean, part of Putin's scheme is to recreate Novorossiya, which is the Russian Empire of Catherine the Great, and he's talked about Peter the Great, who built Russia's empire in the north of Europe. And so Putin clearly, and we don't have to guess at this, he said it in speeches, he says it addressing students in Moscow. He talks about Russia's historic right to the territories of Peter the Great, which means the Baltic states and parts of Scandinavia. And he talks about Catherine the Great's empire as being somehow historically right for Russia. And that includes most of southern Ukraine and Moldova and parts of Romania and all of the Black Sea. And so it's a clear example of imperialism. And what Putin is saying is that the legal settlement, when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, and the legal settlement that was created by which 15 new states came into existence, one state, Soviet Union, went out of existence, and 15 new states, that is Russia and 14 new neighbors, all came into existence. And he's saying that in the case of Ukraine, and by implication some of the others as well, that legal settlement doesn't carry weight as against the historical record, which shows Russia dominated some of those territories, so it has a right to get them back as well. And if he's going to take that view, somebody ought to remind him about the Mongol Empire, because not so long before that, only about 300 years before that, Moscow was under the Mongol Empire. So on that basis, Mongolia and Kazakhstan have got some pretty big claims to Western Russia. It's a ridiculous argument, but it's the sort of confusion in Putin's mind as he makes these statements as to what this war is all about. Is it about imperialism? Yes, it is. Is it about the lack of legitimacy of the 1991 settlement? Apparently. Is it about America's war on Russia? Apparently. Is it all about the Nazis in Ukraine? Apparently. You never know. He hops from one justification to another because he's walked himself into a complete blind alley of fighting, and he can't see any way out other than making it seem to be about something else.
I mean, going back to what you were saying earlier, Michael, we seem to kind of be in a stalemate of attrition at the moment because, as you rightly said, if he couldn't win it in the very beginning, he wasn't going to win it at all. So if we look at it from that point of view, how long will the current funding at current levels last? I mean, we've military aid alone, we're over at 61 billion plus of what's been given in the last 12 months to the Ukraine. And how long will the Western will be there to support Ukraine? I mean, how long can we drain funds from these other sovereign nations supporting the Ukraine?
Well, in theory, as long as it takes, because what's at stake for the Western world is extremely high. I mean, the stakes for us are really high, much higher than just the integrity of Ukraine, because this is the biggest challenge to the Western world order in the last 30 or 40 years, and arguably it's the biggest challenge since the Second World War. So there's an awful lot at stake. And although the amounts of money are high, in relative terms, they're not. I mean, if you think about even the American contribution, which I know the Republicans in the States, some Republicans are getting very upset about, it's still less than 5% of the whole defense budget in America. And for that 5%, they are basically destroying the Russian army and putting Russia back several years in terms of its own development and its status as a global power. If the Western strategy works, then this will be a very, very cost-effective way of reducing one of the key challenges to America's security. Granted, America wants to spend most of its defense money on worrying about China. But if you assume that, let's say, the American defense budget should spend, let's say, 60% of it on China and 20% of it on Russia and the other 20% on everything else that the Americans want to do, let's just assume that. Well, if that's the case, then they're still achieving all their objectives against Russia for 5%, not 20%. It's a very good deal, although the amounts of money are very high in strategic terms. This, without putting any American troops in danger, without America getting involved actually in a shooting war, is achieving its secondary, if its first objective is China, its second objective is Russia, it's achieving that objective very cheaply indeed.
I think, Michael, big shock to the West was, we measure power in terms of growth in GDP. We had this 21st century definition, and we said about other autocracies like Russia that they had a 19th century definition, which was that traditional conquest of territory, even at the expense of its GDP. And the shock for Europe has been, in a sense, the convergence between that 19th century and 21st century definition of power. We never thought that we would have to confront that 19th century definition. We never thought we would have to go back in time, in a sense, which is what we've done. And as a result of that, when people speak about, in the past, Kissinger was speaking about a negotiated settlement, but he was advocating very strongly a compromise. Do you not think that the danger of a compromise is that it undermines our 21st century definition, in that already from the 20th century in the UN Charter, it's got enshrined the prohibition of use of force against territorial integrity or the political independence of another state? And would a settlement be setting a dangerous precedent by legitimizing conquering foreign lands due to having imperialist designs? And more broadly, would it fail to hold Putin to account for targeting civilians? We're talking here about war crimes, not only this expansionist 19th century impulse.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. Angela Merkel said that Putin has a 19th century mentality when it comes to security, because he thinks in territorial terms. He thinks of security on the map. He looks at the map and what colours you want to colour the map in. And that's what he worries about. And what he sees, of course, is that NATO has enlarged itself 9 times since 1949. And 6 of those 9 times have been while he's been sitting in the Kremlin. And the borders of NATO are now 1,000 miles closer to Moscow than they were. That's what he sees. Now, we say in the West, well, so what? That doesn't matter, because NATO is overtly a defensive alliance. Putin just doesn't see it that way. And so he worries a lot about territory. He worries about the way security looks on a map. And when we think about what Kissinger did say, he's changed his tune a bit recently, but what he did say in the early part of the war is really pure appeasement. And this is how appeasement works. We say, look, give them something. Just give them something. And then the problem will go away for a couple of years at least, and then we can all settle down. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. Kaja Kallas is the wonderful Prime Minister of Estonia. She says that she was told years ago how the Russians negotiate. And they said she got this from Molotov and then Gromyko. And they said, look, what you do if you're a Russian, you demand something. You don't ask about it. You don't open up negotiations. You demand it. And then you don't give an inch in those demands. And then somebody in the West eventually will say, look, give them something. Just give them something to get rid of the issue. And then you end up with a third or a half of something you never had in the first place. That's exactly how appeasement works. It worked that way in the 1930s, and that's the way it continues to work.
You could say that that's exactly how Iran has conducted its nuclear talks as well.
Precisely. It's bite and hold, bite and hold. Take a bite and hold it. Take another bite and hold it. And always appeasement works on the victim side by saying, well, maybe it'll be okay this time. Maybe this will be enough. Maybe things will change. Maybe it'll buy us time. And in this case, I mean, Putin has used these tactics very successfully since 2008. Putin went to Munich, to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, interestingly. And he was really angry. He was visibly angry about NATO's enlargement plans. And nobody took him seriously. They said, okay, well, he's angry. So what? Objectively, it doesn't make any difference. He was angry. And in 2008, when the Georgia war began, where the Georgians really played into his hand, Saakashvili overplayed his hand, and NATO was casual in the way it talked about eventual membership, which I said at the time is a very foolish thing to say, eventual membership of NATO for Georgia and Ukraine. And when Saakashvili overplayed his hand in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the Russians moved in and conducted a brief and victorious war. And Putin saw then that the West was prepared to give up things in order to keep him quiet. And that's exactly what happened in 2014 in Crimea. Let's just give up things to keep him quiet. That was the Minsk II process. It was a lousy, lousy process that was developed by France and Germany. Britain had nothing to do with it. I mean, disgracefully, Britain just walked away from the whole thing as though it was nothing to do with us. And the French and the Germans came up with a process which basically was a formula to give the Russians the Donbass and take it away from Ukraine. And that was appeasement. And so this time decided he could go for broke. I mean, I think there are other factors in him going for broke in 2022, but it was a progressive process. And that is the way appeasement works. And what is at stake, of course, is the rules-based international order. And I think, as you say yourself, war crimes, aggression, I mean, there's 60,000 war crimes, allegedly. There are 60,000 cases where there is some evidence that in due course will be examined. Been a year of war crimes, of civilian bombing, which in itself is a war crime. Bombing civilian targets is in any case a war crime. And aggression is a crime against the UN Charter and is condemned in the UN Charter and was condemned by the International Court of the United Nations within days of the invasion taking place. So what's at stake here is the future of the rules-based international order. And the reason that more than half of the population of the rest of the world are holding off, they are not condemning Putin. 40 states will not condemn Putin. And those 40 states at the UN, 40 out of 190 odd, those 40 states involve more than half of the world's population. And the reason they're not condemning Putin is because the leaderships of those countries, China, India, Pakistan, South Africa, important countries, they're holding off because they do not believe that the West will any longer enforce a rules-based international order. They believe that it is collapsing, and they're not going to commit themselves to what they think might turn out to be the losing side. That's the danger.
That's a really important point, because I had previously said that the reason why they were non-committal was simply because they were non-aligned, they were hedging. But at a more fundamental level, yeah, they are undermining the rules-based international order. And for the same reason, for me, this is not just about Ukraine. This is also about, more broadly, China watching what our reaction is going to be, and then are thinking, okay, how do we factor this into our playbook vis-a-vis Taiwan? And Iran is thinking, okay, how do we inch towards the nuclear status? Are we going to sort of flex our muscles regionally?
Yeah.
So I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on how this will impact both China and Iran, because what I see very much when you talk about the challenge to the rules-based international order, I see coalescing an increased alignment between Russia, Iran, and China, which is incredibly dangerous. And this could easily, if China is going to be putting weapons into the field, this could lead to World War III. So I just wonder how you think, what the butterfly effects are for both China and Iran.
Yeah, I think the global South, as we call it these days, doesn't have a lot of faith in the rules-based international order. They think it's been upheld hypocritically, which it has. And we've got to be honest with ourselves. We, the West, we played fast and loose with the rules. While we were dominant after the end of the Cold War for 30 years, we played fast and loose with the rules when it suited us. And now it's coming back to haunt us. And so the global South, it doesn't have a whole lot of faith.
But sorry, Michael, I do have to stop you there for a sec. Bear in mind as well, the irony is that China and Russia, one of the reasons why they were against the intervention in Libya was because they decried foreign intervention in other states' affairs. And that's exactly what they're doing now.
Yeah, exactly. No, when it comes to hypocrisy, the Western world scores, 7 or 8 out of 10, but China scores 11 out of 10. Russia scores 12 out of 10. The world is a cynical and hypocritical place. And in a way, to cut to the chase on this legitimacy issue, it seems to me that this whole war in Ukraine is going to move from an argument about who is right to who will prevail, who will win. And once it is clear who will prevail, then the rest of the world, the global South, will line up behind who they think will win. That's exactly what happened in the Cold War. It's exactly what happened in the Second World War. States stand off until they realize which side will prevail, which is why it's very, very important for the future of the Western world that it is seen to prevail in this case. Now, that we can argue about what that means, prevailing. I've got a very clear view of what victory should look like, which you may or may not want to come to. But the rest of the world has to see that Putin is going to fail. And then a lot of countries, not China probably, but, India and Pakistan and South Africa and other countries will suddenly become, and Latin American countries, will become seized with moral outrage at the way the Russians have behaved after a year of war crimes and brutality. And they'll suddenly discover how brutal the Russians have been and how illegitimate the whole thing has been. But they'll only discover that when it's clear that the Russians are on the losing side.
How do you think this impacting China and Iran?
Okay, yeah, the China and Iran issue is very right, because China, Iran and Russia, along with North Korea, are the great revisionist powers. Now, we can not worry too much about North Korea. That's a damn nuisance, but it's not strategically so important. Iran is important, and Russia and China are the most important because they are the two revisionist countries in the world. The 4 big powers in the world are America, China, Russia, and India. And China and Russia are revisionist in the sense that they want the world to work on different bases. They want the Western world to be reduced in influence. They want the rules to be changed. They want the UN to look different. They want the trade rules of the world, liberal free trade. They don't want that the way it works. They don't want the present financial system to operate the same way. So they are in the way that we had revisionist powers in the 20s and 30s. We've now got 2 big revisionist powers who are trying to change the rules. And so they have a natural affinity, even though You could say, look, the alliance between Russia and China is very specific. It's probably not going to last very long. There's an awful lot that divides them, and that's true. And it's a sort of marriage of convenience for the time being, and I think that's true as well. But underlying that, they share a revisionist view of the world, and the Iranians too, under the present regime, are also revisionist. And so that pulls them together on the assumption that anything that is bad for the West, they think is good for them, even though their specific interests, they do vary quite a lot. And one final point on the Russia-China issue is that it's not at all an alliance or a partnership with Russia is getting weaker and weaker. If you look now, even this week, just one indicator, the Russians are selling China oil at $40 a barrel, $40. That's less than half the world price. They're they're on their knees to get the Chinese to take their oil. The Chinese are running a very hard bargain. So are the Indians, incidentally. Russia is in desperate straits. They need Chinese weapons to avoid losing the war. They need to sell oil at half price to the Chinese to get them to take it. Russia's economy is stuttering. The Chinese economy, is the economy for the future. You can look at any indication you like that Putin pretends that he's an equal with Xi Jinping, but actually Xi Jinping has got him on his knees on just about every issue that matters. And that's the way that partnership will go. It'll never be, for the foreseeable future, a partnership of equals.
Michael, that brings up a point that we spoke about earlier on in the show, is that this seems to be that Putin is running against the clock. At some point, he's going to run out of money and resources, men, supplies, weapons. So, really, we're just kind of running the clock out on his resources. So with that in mind, what do you think the prospects are of a negotiated settlement as Putin's invasion of Ukraine breached the code enshrined in the UN Charter that prohibits any use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state, and based on the fact that he is eventually, at some point, going to run out of resources, money, weapons, and people?
That's right. From my understanding of the sources I look at, it's a 2 to 3 year prospect for him, that in a way he needs to keep the war going to stay in power. And of course, the war may remove him from power, but he's got no other option now but to keep the thing going. And what he's playing for more than anything else, well, two things. One is that the Chinese can stop him losing by supplying him with weapons. If the Chinese don't supply him with weapons, then he'll continue to lose on the battlefield for all sorts of reasons. If the Chinese will supply him with weapons, then they can stop him from losing on the battlefield. That's exactly what the Russians did to Syria in 2015. Assad was about to lose. The Russians stepped in and prevented Assad from losing. And now here we are, 7 years later, 8 years later, Assad is the winner from the Syrian civil war with all the brutality that goes along with it. That's what the Chinese-Russian relationship is, exactly the same. They are in a position now, if they choose to do it, of stopping Putin from losing on the battlefield simply by supplying him with what he needs. What is he playing for? He's playing for the next 2 to 3 years and two things. One is to weaken the European consensus, to actually split Europe, because this consensus has been much stronger than either he or we thought it would be. It surprised us how effective it's been, to be honest. But he wants to weaken that. But above all, what is he playing for? He's playing for the 2024 American election. If the Biden administration, during the election campaign, starts to have to dial down on the support for Ukraine, it might go away, it might dial up on it, depending on what happens. It's a long time between now and sort of summer 24. But if he dials down on it during the campaign, and if there is a fundamentalist Republican challenger, or even a Trumpist president, Trump or a Trumpist president, then Ukraine loses the war. That's the way the Kremlin thinks. If the Republicans grab the White House, if a Trumpist president becomes president, then if they can last out till 2024, then they win, because American aid will suddenly start to go into reverse. The European consensus will collapse more or less overnight. I sit here in Europe and I have no faith whatsoever, not 1 ounce of faith, that the Europeans would pick up the slack if American leadership was released. So if American leadership is absent, then the Western world stops supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainians lose. They won't lose overnight. They'll fight ferociously. They'll lose slowly, but they lose. That's the drama of the situation that we will face through this time next year when the American elections start. And believe me, I can promise you, from all sorts of things I can't talk about, but I promise you that's what the Kremlin is working for.
It seems to me from what you're saying is that China is the linchpin of whether Putin can sustain this. What's China's motivation to keep Russia in this and moving forward? Because China is also exporting a mass amount of goods. They account for 45% of the products, in the U.S. are coming from China. They're a huge trading partner. What's the advantage for China to ensure that Russia wins?
Exactly. It's very hard to see. It's very contradictory. On the pro side, pro-Russia, you've got Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a personal friend of Putin. There is a sense that they don't want to let down an ally, a fellow revisionist. They talked last year about a partnership without limits. And Xi Jinping, he's not a very bright man, I mean, he's very like Stalin. He's never the cleverest man in the room, but he's the most cunning. He's the one that everyone fears. He's the one that can make things happen, even though he doesn't follow arguments all that well. And so he's not a very flexible man. So on the one hand, you've got the leadership, and that sense, just like with North Korea. I mean, North Korea is a real nuisance to Beijing, but they've got to support it. And there's a feeling now that Moscow is becoming a bit like Pyongyang. It's a real nuisance, a much bigger version of North Korea, but they've got to support it. So you've got that on that side, plus the sense that, well, anything that ties up the United States, anything that distracts the US and the Europeans and pushes back on NATO involvement, NATO influence, which is what this war was originally thought to be doing from China's point of view, all that's good. So that's all of it on the one side. But on the other side is the huge pragmatism of the Chinese position. Chinese trade with Russia is about 3% of China's total, 3%. The vast, vast majority of China's trade, as you say, is with North America and Europe. In monetary terms, that Russian trade with Russian Chinese trade is worth about $150, $160 billion a year. Its trade with the United States is worth about $500 billion a year, and it used to be over $1 trillion because of recent arguments and recent decoupling. It's now down to about half of what it was and will be in the future. And China's trade with Europe is about $500 billion. So its natural trade with America is about $1 trillion, but now down to half that. Its trade with Europe is $500 to $600 billion, and its trade with Russia is about $160 billion. There's no comparison. And so China's interests, its long-term interests, are in not harming its trade with Europe and the United States or North America. And one of the things that the Chinese really fear, and this is where the Americans have actually, I think, are playing a very good game, not all behind the scenes, they've made it pretty clear as well, but they are very vigorous behind the scenes, is in showing China the importance of sanctions. The Chinese can now see what sanctions look like against a big power. They've seen what sanctions look like against Iran or Cuba or North Korea. But now they see what Western sanctions really could look like against a big power like Russia or China. And they realize how good the United States can be, European Union potentially, but it's much slower, in secondary sanctions, in working out which companies are actually in a secondary way aiding government that's sanctioned. And the Chinese are really frightened of secondary sanctions because of all of their trade with Europe and North America. So, that's the two sides of it. The one side is the political, the Xi Jinping revisionist geopolitical argument, which says back Russia, stop Russia from losing. The other side is the pragmatic globalization economic side, which says the cost to China of supporting Russia through thick and thin may be simply too great. And this war is bad for Russia as it is. I mean, the war is already creating a global recession. The Chinese economy is already suffering from that, in addition to its post-COVID slowdown and so on.
Michael, something that you said beforehand, it's a really terrifying prospect if we are confronted by a scenario where China decides to arm Russia, America decides to withdraw its support, and Europe doesn't pick up the slack. Then it's like a World War III that we're not even...
Well, it's not a World War III. I resile against these ideas that this will become a sort of a more general war. But I think it becomes law of the jungle then. If the Chinese prevent the Russians from losing, and the United States, in effect, stops leading, and the Europeans just literally collapse effectively collapse. They'll say all the right things, but they won't do them. Then we're into the law of the jungle. And the rest of the world will see, okay, the rules-based international order as it was conceived in 1945 is over. The United States, was thrown out of Afghanistan, made a stand in Ukraine, but couldn't keep it up. The Europeans are pathetic. The law of the jungle means that we better line up with the powerful, and the powerful will be the autocracies. And that message will go very strongly through Africa, through Asia, even Latin America. The Latin Americans, no Latin American government would accept America's generous offer last month to actually transfer weapons to Ukraine and get one-for-one replacements in modern American equipment. A lot of Latin American countries, had equipment that would be very useful in Ukraine. Not a single Latin American country would agree. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, the big three, all of them said no. And opinion in Latin America, public opinion, is strictly neutral. It's about 60-65% in favor of neutrality. So even Latin America will not line up behind the United States on the moral issue that this war seems to pose. And so, yes, I'm quite optimistic about what may happen in this war from a Western point of view, but there'll be a lot of fighting to do and a lot of dying to do before that is played out.
I don't mean to be cliched here, but when you say the law of the jungle, what you're really talking about is, to quote Fukuyama, it's the reversal, it's the return of history, it's the undermining of the US-led Western triumph at the end of the Cold War. And, there is no unipolar era anymore. You've got really that challenge to the international-based rules order. It would have succeeded.
Correct. I mean, I call it the law of the jungle because the autocracies, or the dictatorships as they were in the 20th century, the disruptors have always been with us in the international system, but for the last 400 years have never dominated. They've disrupted and they've created problems, but the system has always been run since the mid-17th century by, if you like, the sort of the Enlightenment powers.
Now you would get multipolarity of East and West.
Yes, and the point is that the disruptors, the autocrats, the barbaric governments would then have more power than anybody else. It'd be the law of the jungle in that sense. I mean, and in the jungle, there is a sort of an order because, certain animals don't go up against certain other animals. They just leave them alone. And big animals just do what they want. They sleep where they want, etc., etc. That's the way it would be. So that the law of the jungle, if the rules-based international order goes, United States withdraws into itself, Europe just sort of puts its head in the sand as always, then you would find the system for the next 50, 60, 80 years will be run according to what these half a dozen autocratic governments said was acceptable to them. Everybody would bow to what they wanted or avoid them or avoid standing up for something that was important. That's the law of the jungle, where for the first time in 400 years, the disruptors hold the whip hand.
Michael, I kind of want to put you on the spot here a little bit and say, if you had to call it your gut feeling, where we sit right now, do you think that China will continue to support Russia?
No. If I have to call it, I think that the Chinese will not supply. It may turn out to be wrong about this, but I don't think the Chinese will supply arms. I think the motives against it are too great. I think that they will try to find a way of keeping Russia going whilst they sort of shepherd it towards some sort of settlement. I think Xi Jinping is the only person who can rescue Putin now, actually, and to sort of shepherd the Russians into a situation toward the end of the year where they might go in for some sort of ceasefire. I don't think there's any peace possible. The idea of a negotiated settlement that everyone's prepared to go along with, I think is impossible at the moment. But the possibility of a ceasefire is plausible after the next set of offensives. So when the Russians have launched their offensive and the Ukrainians have launched their offensive, there will be a new situation on the ground, one way or another, in Ukraine. And when we see what that situation is, round about late summer or autumn, then there's certain political issues might arise from that. And so it's possible that a shaky ceasefire could be organized, and the Chinese would be behind that, I think, if there were a shaky ceasefire, because only they could bring Putin to that sort of ceasefire table. That's what I think will happen.
And just looking at this from a broader scope, until that happens, what will be the greatest ongoing impact on Europe and the rest of the world economies and day-to-day living? We're already in a recession. We're already seeing huge cost of living, issues in the UK and Europe. We're seeing massive inflation, people that can't afford to pay heating bills and, gas prices going through the roof. What are the ongoing impacts on the economy and day-to-day life, and how much longer do you think Europeans in the West will suffer that?
Western opinion is, it's worried. A lot of people, about a third, if you look at the recent opinion polls in both the United States and across Europe and other Western countries, about a third, between 30 and 40% of people believe that Russia should be opposed in this, want to fight the war the way it's been fought. Another third want negotiations because they just think, well, we want the fighting to stop. Although it's not clear they understand that negotiations now means that Russia wins. So public opinion is not as volatile on it as might have been thought. And leadership opinion is still very solid, to my surprise, I have to say. The leaders of Europe and the Western world are still solid, and they're not yet being put under tremendous pressure by their own publics to change their policy. Now, that we thought that this winter would be the crunch point. It hasn't been. It's been a more mild winter. The energy crisis hasn't been as bad as we thought. And so the public are suffering in the Western world with cost of living crises, but it hasn't rolled itself up yet into a demand that we stop supporting Ukraine in the war. And as long as Ukraine can show that it's capable of winning, and that's the key issue, that's where the battlefield links to the strategic level. As long as Ukraine can show that there is hope, that they can throw the Russians out of a lot of their territory, if not all their territory, in the next year, and I think support will be maintained. But if the Ukrainians can't show that, if it looks as if this is actually going to be a stalemate for a year, 2 years, 3 years, then I think public opinion will then say, I'm not sure we can sustain this. But it hasn't happened yet, which is why an awful lot depends. There aren't many wars where things that happen on the battlefield really are important to the broader strategic question. But in this case, they are. If the Ukrainians can be decisive on the battlefield in the next 3 months, if they can show that they can decisively kick the Russians out of a large swathe of their territory, then I think the Western consensus will remain in fairly good shape for another year or so. If they can't show that, I think it might start to fray quite quickly.
As anticipated, Michael, you're not simply a sort of policy analyst, you are a rock star. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure. Well, it's not pleasant talking about these things, but if we don't talk about them, they won't get any better.
I think most people are talking about things at an operational level, and what we did today is we combined it with that 10,000-foot strategic overview, and that, for me, is really, really fascinating.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. That was absolutely incredible.
Okay, nice to be part of it. Thank you.
Okay, well, this leads us into our final segment of the show, which is who are the Godfather characters? Barack, this is all you.
The strategic ambiguity that's displayed by China, India, and even Russia to a degree is reminiscent of Fredo. When Mo Green declares about Fredo that he was banging cocktail waitresses 2 at a time, he demonstrates...
Can you say that on the podcast, that he was banging waitresses? I don't know if that's sanctioned.
It's true, though. It's true.
Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry. I got very deeply distracted by that. But okay, on with your analogy. If anyone was bored and not listening to our podcast, they're still like sitting up and listening now.
Fredo wasn't only the dumb simpleton, he was also the duplicitous character in The Godfather, and he ultimately betrayed Michael Corleone with Hyman Roth. And that is demonstrative of the ambivalence, the lack of decisiveness and commitment to either Russia and a broad challenging international order, or a commitment to the West. And I think that is very much modelled on Fredo.
I'm still going to go back to your early commentary. I was taking you seriously right up until you made that comment, and I think you just lost all credibility in that one foul swoop statement. So
Mo Green says that Fredo was banging cocktail waitresses 2 at a time.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to cut that one out.
No, we can't. We cannot. Seriously, we need that.
Okay, so now we need to have a rated R moniker at the beginning of our podcast of, if you're listening to this on the school run, maybe we should give a warning. Anyway, I think before we get ourselves into any further trouble and we get complaints from people who are on the school run listening to the end of our show, that we're going to wrap that for us today. That is it for this episode. Please make sure to tune in next week for our episode on Russian sanctions and the impact this is having on the world and your business. The Godfather Wars is an Electric House production. Our executive producers are Mark Netter and Peter Raffleson, and our producers, Leah Tedrow and Barack Seener. If you like our podcast, please rate, review, and tell your friends and colleagues to listen in.
Hey there, fabulous souls. I'm Stephanie Baklaan.
And I'm Eden Alpert.
And we're the hosts of the brand new podcast, Unapologetically Fab.
Get ready to join us on an amazing and real journey as we dive into life after 40 and own it.
We're all about changing the narrative, leaning into who you are, and living a life by your own design.
Join us as we embrace life unapologetically and redefine success.
This is Unapologetically Fab,
an Electric House production.
See you there.
Electricast. Hey guys, it's Miriam Love here, and I want to share something very special with you. Check out my new release, All In, the Spanish remixes, out now on Electric House Records. And always remember, be love, share love, all love.
Available now wherever you listen to music.